He like never raised his voice.
Okay, we're going to pick up with our next session. And I am going to introduce John Donnelly, who is right here to my left, who is both correspondent for CQ Roll Call and also the chair of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Team and has been leading it wonderfully for several years. So John is wearing multiple hats here today in moderating this panel.
Thank you, Julie. Can you guys hear me? Just want to make sure. I hate talking when no one can hear me. So it's great to be here today, and our panel is entitled "Defusing Threatening Situations." What we hope to do is maybe get some. Obviously, you got a lot of practical advice in the previous discussion, but we're going to, maybe dive in a little deeper on a few aspects of it. We're going to take it where the panel wants to go with it, and we're going to take it where you want to go with it based on your questions. We will. What we're talking about here are potentially threatening situations up to violent situations. So we're talking about a spectrum. We're talking about the gamut. I would say everything from you're confronted by a stranger who's using threatening language toward you. You feel as a reporter covering a political rally, a demonstration, that that things are getting out of hand. Maybe things are getting violent. You're at a political rally. Perhaps it's the president's. Just to name one possible threatening situation, and people are yelling at you and making dangerous comments and anti-journalism comments. You're a freelancer overseas in a dangerous situation. So these are some of the scenarios that we can talk about, and others that the panel wants to bring up. So what we'll do is we will have like about 5 minutes or so from each of the panelists, just sort of an opening remark saying, here's what I have to contribute to this conversation. And then we'll have about 40 minutes of questions. And I'll ask a few, and you all are encouraged to ask a few. So I guess I should just point out, just get it out of the way, that I was involved in a physical situation. In that spectrum of violence, I was on the left end. I was a recipient of being roughed up at the Federal Communications Commission in 2017. I usually cover defense, but I was there to run down a tip that was too juicy for me not to run down, even though it was off my beat. And I figured I would try to ask one of the commissioners. And they were having a hearing on an internet-related issue. So I tried to ask one of the commissioners as they were walking off the stage, and as I was asking the question, security personnel at the FCC backed me up into a wall and pinned me there for about almost at least 15 seconds or so. And so I was and they said later that they thought I was a threat because they had received some death threats to commissioners that day. So that was a situation where they were misperceiving the situation. There's no reason to think I was a threat. I was dressed like this. I had a notebook. I had a tape recorder. I had a pen. Nothing about the way I asked the question was threatening. So, sometimes the threat, with all due respect to law enforcement, can come from security personnel and police. And the way I handled it was, I'm glad I handled it the way I did, which was not to fight back, because I think that's probably the worst thing that I could have done. And that's what I would just suggest to people is, you don't want the story to be about, the violence that the reporter, was responsible for. You want to be, obviously you don't want to be in the situation to begin with, but if you're in it, you want to have that moral high ground. So I would just throw that out there as, one of the scenarios and one that I was personally involved in. So let's just go down the line, and I want to introduce our panel. I want to start with Margaux Ewen, who is the Executive Director of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, which is an organization that is named after the freelance journalist, the American freelance journalist who was murdered in Syria in 2014. The group is dedicated, they are advocates for the freedom of all Americans held hostage, unjustly detained abroad, and they promote the safety of journalists worldwide. We're very happy to have Margaux here with us. And actually, why don't I do, instead of introducing everybody and then going, why don't I just introduce Margaux and then ask Margaux to say a few words, and then I'll go to our next panelist.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here this morning. As John said, the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation advocates for the freedom of all Americans held hostage abroad. There is currently one journalist that we know of that is detained in Syria since 2012. That's Austin Tice, and see a lot of people in the room wearing the Free Austin Tice pins. That's why we're wearing them in solidarity. But there are many other Americans that we fight for on a daily basis in improving U.S. hostage policy. Since James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, Peter Kassig, and Caleb Mueller were killed by ISIS while in captivity. But we also promote journalist safety because we recognize the risks that journalists take, particularly freelancers, which Nadine is going to talk a little bit more about, are really elevated, and there are things that our community can do to make sure journalists are better prepared and aware of the risks before they may pay the ultimate price with their lives for covering this story. I just want to know, by show of hands, how many people in this room have received safety training before? Right, a fair amount of people. How many of those people received safety training when they were in journalism school or university? So a noticeable gap there. Which, I want to take the opportunity to highlight the fact that we have developed a curriculum for graduate journalism schools with Medill, Northwestern University, which is a safety curriculum, and we base it along the documentary made about Jim Foley's life and captivity called Jim, the James Foley Story, that was made released on HBO, which you can still stream online. And it's really designed to kind of get that safety culture embedded into journalism students at an early age. But we're trying to get that even in the ground earlier at the undergraduate level right now, which is what we're developing. But the current curriculum that is available online to any schools on our website, jamesfoleyfoundation.org. So I would encourage all of you all to go online, take a look at it, share it. But really, we think the earlier you can start this safety training, basic principles, the better, so that people know what they're going into in this increasingly dangerous profession. There's a lot of threats in the world right now to journalists, but also increasingly here at home. The U.S. is ranked 48th out of 180 countries now in the World Press Freedom Index that Reporters Without Borders puts out. So I just want to say that that's a changing situation which we need to adapt to and make sure our journalists are better prepared. So I don't want to go over my time. John, if you want to introduce someone else on the
all right,
panel.
and we'll definitely have you expand on some of those things. So next person I want to introduce to Margaux's left is Danny Spriggs, who is Vice President of Global Security at the Associated Press. He is we're headquartered in New York City. He spent 28 years in the Secret Service. He worked his way up to Deputy Director. And welcome, Danny, and give us an idea of what you want to tell us about today.
Thanks, John. The bottom line at the end of the day, when I finish or addressing your questions and any comment I make, is one slogan that we currently go by at the Associated Press, and that is proper planning and practice prevents poor performance. Now, I would like to get credit for that slogan, but I can't. There was a guy by the name of Rascoya, who was the chief security officer on 9/11 in one of the tower buildings. That was his mantra. He was credited with saving almost 3,000 people in that tower, sacrificing his own life. And so everything that we do at the AP is about planning, proper planning and practice in moving forward. The AP has been around since 1846, covering wars and conflicts around the world. It wasn't until my hire in 2008 that the senior management at the AP decided to have a single component within their organizational structure to just deal with security and safety issues. That's over 160 years. 160 years. It was believed that during the war, the Gulf War in 2003, 2004, that journalists were being severely injured or killed, and an increase in that number. Senior management at the AP felt as though that depending on the person you talk to, the opinion rests whether or not decisions were being made on the competitiveness of getting journalists or sacrificing security in order to do that. Now, depending on who you talk to, you can get pros and cons on both sides. But one thing that is a fact, and our senior executive editor, Sally Busby, will tell you this when she was the bureau chief in Baghdad, that 70% of her time was being spent on safety and security issues in Baghdad relative to the things that she was trained to do and they do best, and that's gather news. And so therefore, now all of that comes to me, and what's one of my jobs and focuses is to relieve our journalists from that component that you face every day. Clearly, things have, like I said, a lot of my work is done with our international journalists working overseas. In light of the last couple of years, our domestic journalists have become the news, if you will, because of the various rhetoric out there. And I know this because our journalists report the different threats, whether it's physical or electronic or by mail or by phone. They come to our shop. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but one of the things you've heard that our previous presenters, you'll hear from me as well, prevention, avoidance, the question that came up earlier about a single journalist working in an uncomfortable environment, we avoid those. You should not put yourself in that position. And that's our message clearly. Somebody's going to tell that story. We want you to be the one to tell that story. So avoidance and proactive measures is our focus. Training is crucial. And of course, providing the necessary tools for you to be able to minimize risk is what my shop is responsible for at the AP.
Great. Thank you very much. Next up is, to my left, Nadine Hoffman, who is Deputy Director of International Women's Media Foundation, and that is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to supporting female journalists worldwide. Nadine began her career as a reporter in Boston, right? And she's been part of the International Women's Media Foundation team since 2010. So welcome, Nadine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. So as you mentioned, we're here to talk about the women's stuff. My organization has been around for 30 years, and we have been working very hard to build an ecosystem of support for female journalists around the world. That includes both Americans and journalists working abroad, and really to advance women in the news industry. And we do that in a variety of ways. We run reporting fellowships. We give grants to do reporting. We also have a very strong safety focus because we think that safety is really an essential part of the equation in order for women to be able to fully participate in this industry. And we are also especially focused, and have been more so as the industry has shifted, on freelancers and the needs of freelancers today. I'm curious to know how many people in the audience are actually working as freelancers. Can you raise your hand if you are? Okay, so quite a few. Yeah, so that's what we're seeing too. For our opportunities, I would say the vast majority, probably up to 70% of people who are applying for our grants and safety training are freelancers. And we all know in this room that there are a lot of forces that are trying to shut up journalists here and abroad. And especially, I think we can say that women and journalists of color are particularly targeted, as well as journalists from marginalized communities. And we also believe as an organization that our democracy really depends on the diversity of voices as a cornerstone of a free press. But attacks that are happening both offline that we've talked about so far and online that I think we're going to talk about on the next panel are really silencing those voices, and they're driving particularly women and minority journalists out of the industry. We've done a number of research studies on safety of journalists, particularly the most recent one we did last year focused on online safety for female journalists and online harassment. We had 600 US-based journalists reply to that survey, and what we found is that the overwhelming majority of them are facing attacks, and digital and physical attacks. And I think the important finding, the one that I want to highlight here, was that a third of the survey respondents who took this survey said that they had considered leaving the industry as a result of it. I think that's pretty significant. And that was higher among the younger journalists who took it as well. So as newsrooms, as editors who may be in this room today, these are things that we need to be thinking about to better support our colleagues in the industry. At the IWMF, we do a lot of safety training. We've run over 40 hostile environment training courses. Primarily, we've done those in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America. But starting this September, we're going to be launching a series of US-based hostile environments trainings. If you're interested in those, we're taking applications on our website. We also are very active as part of the Journalists in Distress Network. We do emergency assistance grants for journalists who are in crisis as a result of their work. And I encourage you to learn more about the very important work that the JID is doing around the world to support journalists who need asylum, who need legal assistance, who need medical care, as well as psychological care, which is an important component we haven't really talked about yet today. So much of the content that we cover and teach in our training is not specific to women, and a lot of it really has to do with what you said, which is planning and preparation and sort of this left of the event, even though that's not really the terminology we use. But some of the things that I would recommend for anyone working in the field today is just really understanding what a risk assessment is. If you haven't already, there are some great resources online about how to develop a risk assessment. And the other thing that we are really strongly focused on is how we do check-in protocols, both as an organization when we're taking journalists to the field and then encouraging freelancers to have those protocols before they go out on assignment. We're really religious about using trusted fixers and drivers. If you are able to have the luxury to have those support staff, it's important to vet them. And I know we've said today, like, the buddy system is really important, but we also recognize that a lot of freelancers, as you said, are going out there alone, especially if they're working as visual journalists and you've got a camera in front of your face. That can be really a difficult challenge. We haven't today talked very much about trauma or self-care, but I think that's a critical piece of this conversation as well. And we use the saying, which we did not invent, but you have to put on your own oxygen mask first in order to be able to help others. So we really believe that asking for help when you need it and understanding the resources that are available to you to take care of yourself, and by self-care I don't mean wine and yoga, even though we endorse both of those things at the IWMF. And also, I would just say that, you know, maybe this sounds a little funny, but having safety training and investing in that safety training, as well as having insurance, are a vital part of your well-being as a journalist. If your camera equipment gets stolen and you don't have insurance to be able to replace it, you're losing your livelihood. So we think those kinds of preparation tools are really just like vital to the industry. And asking for help doesn't make you seem weak. We also are really strongly focused on the importance of male allies in this industry, and that's something that we're about to launch a major campaign around. I'm going to say something that is probably controversial, and this is not specific to journalists, but we believe that the biggest threats that women are facing today, and this is both inside and outside the newsroom, are related to men. I want to give an example, because I'm not attacking men. But I want to give the example of Kim Wall, who you probably all have heard of, the Swedish journalist who was murdered while she was reporting about 2 years ago. She was a member of our community. She was a fellow. Many of us knew her. And now we have come to know her family. And she was really just a wonderful woman. Kim was killed while she was reporting, but she wasn't killed because of the story that she took on. She wasn't doing a dangerous story, and she wasn't in a war zone. She was reporting in Scandinavia, and she was killed as a result of a dangerous man. So I think that just for us to recognize that we really need men to also be our biggest supporters, men in this industry who, when they see behaviors that are threatening to women from their colleagues, from their male colleagues, from editors, from sources in the field, that they will also, when they see something, that they say something and they really stand up for us. I want to just, related to that, I want to just make the point that even though not everyone in the industry feels this way, we really strongly believe that sexual harassment is a safety issue. It is not a workplace issue. If you are not safe in your workplace, you cannot do your job effectively, and management needs to treat it that way. So we really would advocate for more holistic policies to address the full range of digital and physical threats that journalists are facing today in their newsrooms, including things like microaggressions and including things like sexual harassment. I also just want to briefly mention, they haven't come up yet today, a Culture of Safety Alliance, which several of our organizations are part of. This was actually created after Jim Foley's death. Diane Foley was integral in the creation of ACOS. They have created safety principles, which all of the members are really strongly advocating that newsrooms adopt, and that there are also principles that apply to freelancer safety. So if you don't know about a culture of safety, you should definitely check out their website. A lot of great resources there as well as best practices for editors and safety personnel in newsrooms to take a look at. I think I've talked a little bit long, but I appreciate your attention.
That's quite all right. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, at the end of our table is Commander Guillermo Rivera, who is head of special operations with the Washington Metropolitan Police Department. He served in the Internal Affairs Division, where he investigated misconduct and corruption allegations. He also served on the Force Investigations Team, which investigated lethal and less than lethal uses of force and in-custody deaths by members of the department. So we're very happy to have Commander Rivera here with us today to tell us about the law enforcement perspective.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me today. So there's a lot of chaos basically involved whenever you respond to a crisis or any of that type of stuff. And of course, you guys are usually on the front line there, it seems. Sometimes you may be there quicker than law enforcement is. And what I hope I can do is clarify some of the managed expectations when law enforcement arrives on a scene, because there's usually a lot of conflict, not just with journalists, but with the public in general. And I think a lot of that has to do just not understanding what the focus of law enforcement is when they show up to a scene, and the way our members are trained to deal with the situation before they can start interacting with the public under normal circumstances. Secondly, somebody mentioned a culture of safety, and I know it's in reference to the website you pointed out to. However, much of our training has to do with that. It has to do with how the members of the public are really the first responders in a lot of our incidents. And there are a lot of steps that they can take when they're faced with an incident before the police arrive. And that may be becoming a very good witness by knowing how to observe something and mentally document what it is that you see, how you're going to relay that to law enforcement or whatever authorities may come up. Also, knowing that in a very critical incident where you may become the victim of something, oftentimes you are really fighting for your life. It's not just, you hear run, hide, fight. What does that really mean? I mean, we're talking about saving your life first, and then, or getting out of the area ideally, or saving your life is really at the end of the day what you're trying to accomplish here. So if for the people in the room here, how many have been through an active shooter presentation by a show of hands? Yeah, so pretty small considering. And oftentimes people who work in a big outfit or something, there are law enforcement personnel that will come in and do those kind of presentations. I have what would some consider the SWAT team under my division, and they do a lot of those presentations. And I would encourage you that if you hear of one or know of one coming up where you are able to be an audience member, you definitely should participate, because I think it'll really open your eyes to what kind of actions you can take, and we'll touch on some of that today, but it's not to the level that you would get by having an in-depth conversation with someone who who does that on a regular basis. I know that many here, there were, how many freelance journalists were here at Race? Only a couple, yeah. So, and how many are local to DC? That, wow, pretty small. So, yeah, I mean, I would imagine if those of you who are affiliated with a larger city, or maybe you probably, what I'll say today probably will translate easily to any of the jurisdictions that you're working in, that type of thing. So that's pretty much it. I think we'll get more into it once we get moving.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I want to go back to Margaux, who started us off, and and you were. I know there's so much more that you can tell us about the overall security situation, and I guess we should focus mainly on the U.S. I mean, you talked about our ranking in the world, 48th out of 60.
Yeah.
Talk about, you know, where our ranking has gone in recent years, and what some of the most illustrative types of threats are in the U.S. for reporters,
Sure.
or anything else you want to unpack
Sure.
from your work.
Yeah, so I used to work at Reporters Without Borders,
Right.
full disclosure. But the United States has really come far in a negative trend of journalist safety here at home, and I believe the ranking has evolved from 43rd place to 48th in the past 2 or 3 years. And you know, one of the reasons for the decline between 2017 and 2018, so the last year's decline, was the Capitol Gazette shooting, which it's the 1-year anniversary today of this assault, murder of 4 journalists and 1 employee of a newspaper by a man who had a grudge against the paper for its reporting. And that's an active shooter scenario, a scenario after which, at the time when I was working at Reporters Without Borders, I wanted our staff to undergo an active shooter training because being part of a press freedom organization in this climate, I was concerned that we could be a target too, because we were constantly raising these issues and calling out the rhetoric against journalists and denouncing attacks against the press. And I think, obviously, newsrooms are far more at risk than the press freedom organizations themselves, but that kind of highlights the fact that newsrooms are taking much more, they're making much more of a big deal about safety initiatives. They're receiving more and more death threats. There were, I think, bomb threats against multiple news outlets, including CNN, but also local news outlets throughout the year last year. There have been violent physical assault at rallies, political rallies. Before that trend kind of ramped up last year, there were already difficult situations for journalists in the United States when they covered protests. When they covered protests, they were more at risk for arrest. And sometimes physical assault from protesters or from even members of the public authorities, so police officers who are responding to the protests. So I think there are a lot of situations where journalists in the United States have to be aware of those risks and how they can mitigate them and take the necessary precautions. And you know, unfortunately, those trends of violence and threats are on the rise because the Capitol Gazette shooting, for example, is, I think, the deadliest shooting in a newsroom in recent American history. And unfortunately, I have a feeling it won't be the last such attack. So that's really that highlights the current climate here in the United States. And I think, you know, what Nadine said earlier about women and journalists of color being particularly targeted, if you take a look at the protests against the North Dakota Access Pipeline a couple of years ago now, Native American independent journalists were really the ones getting arrested the most, and they were not working with a big media outlet. You can see the contrast in the news coverage just of arrests of journalists when you compare, was it Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Who got arrested, and someone like Jenny Monet, another case of a Native American independent journalist who got arrested. And so I really think that it's important to discuss, you know, what a journalist can do in that situation, especially when protests have the tendency to turn more and more violent and more volatile this year. We have an election coming up, which means there's going to be a lot more of that kind of activity, rallies and protest activity. And the situation that John was victim to of, somebody roughing him up at an event where he should have been free to ask questions in our own government. That seems to happen more and more. Access issues can bleed into journalists either getting, a hand in their face from somebody's handler and prevented of asking a question. And what do you do in that situation to mitigate risk but still do your job? And I think one of the takeaways, even though this was from an international context, from Jim Foley and his legacy is, reporters should ask themselves, is my story, the risk that I'm about to take, if I'm going to put my life on the line, is my story going to change the outcome of what I'm covering? Is it going to have a really big impact? Because if the answer is no, your life is really important, even though the story is important too, but the lives of other people that you work with as well, your fixer and your driver, your cameraman or woman, those people's lives are important too. So I think it's really important to make sure that you have an awareness about these kinds of risks, and increasingly here in the US, and don't take for granted the fact that we're in the country of the First Amendment, because 48th place out of 180 countries is really nothing to be proud of. So that's kind of what I would say about general trends.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Danny Spriggs, I'd like to get you to expand on a couple things. Talk a little bit about what some of the kinds of threats you're hearing about, either at AP or what you hear about beyond AP, and then go a little more in depth on what you talked about tools, for proper planning and practice. What are some of those tools? What is AP's approach to preparing journalists to handle threatening situations?
Sure, John, no problem. We're getting the full gamut of threats toward our journalists. Not all of them are based on stories written. Some of them are just based on the fact that they are media, or they're associated with an American news gathering organization. We're getting quite a few of those in our international bureaus, as well as domestically. Just to pick up on your point regarding the idea that journalists need to be prepared and plan. One of the things that is on our questionnaire, let me back up. Before a journalist pitches a story to their editor that they're going into a high-risk area, we have a 2-page questionnaire that we actually give them that they have to answer. It includes everything from, the most important question is, what is the journalistic goal of the risk that you're taking in going to this place? It outlines everything from who's going to be on the team. Is it a cross-format team? Is it photos, video, text going on the proposed trip? We advocate working as teams. We don't advocate individuals or our journalists operating individually. Now, I've been out there with them, these cross-format teams. I know they get separated, so I get that part of it. But without that peripheral 360 coverage, you're putting yourself at risk. So the questionnaire also outlines all of those things that are related to security, i.e., what are the logistics as far as transportation? What are the communications, not only among the team themselves, but are we going to activate our GPS training, tracking for those journalists that are going into these areas? And that is not only internationally, but domestic as well. So we have that capability. And when we activate our tracking, our GPS tracking, it is on a 24-hour basis. And there was a time at the AP where maybe the news editor was going to be responsible for monitoring that activity. When I came on, didn't make a lot of sense to me, particularly if that individual was sleeping that night while you were out working. So we actually now have 24/7 tracking whenever we activate our tracking program. A large part of what I do is coordinate the hostile environment and first aid training course. That is crucial to any journalists that are going into a high-risk area, to include our freelancers. Our freelancers should come to us with that training. If they don't have that training, more than likely, more often than not, they're not going to, be contracted to do that assignment. That is a 3-day course. I do it internally as well as externally. We have a vendor, GJS, that provides that training for us around the world. Not only domestic. In fact, GJS is headquartered in Rockville, Maryland.
That's where I had my training.
Yeah. And so we just recently went to them. Before that, we used, some of you that might have been around a while might be familiar with Centurion, which was out of the UK. We discontinued that contract about 5 years ago. So that training is really critical to us. The important thing is, remember I said planning and practice. One of the things that's a challenge for me is to be able to get refresher training for those individuals that have had the basic training. The challenge is not only budgetary challenges, but availability on the part of journalists, the fact that they may have moved on from time to time. So we've actually set it up where once you've got the basic training, sometime within the next 3 years, you should have gotten refresher training, okay? One of the lessons I learned from Secret Service is that when an incident happens, if it's not instinctive, believe me, it's going to be a situation that's not going to turn out very well. So that repetitive training so that when an incident happens, it's more instinctive as opposed to you trying to figure out or going to the list of paper, what am I supposed to do here or there. Tools that we provide. My shop provides protective gear, personal protective gear. The AP has afforded me a pretty good budget, so we provide body armor for our folks, ballistic helmets if necessary. We also have the hardened baseball caps. In the event, you don't need a ballistic helmet, but it's headgear for covering protests and demonstrations. We also provide gas masks, something that our journalists are faced with in covering protests and demonstrations. Our gas masks are of a high quality that law enforcement uses. It is designed to filter any and all chemical agents that law enforcement would use to suppress a crowd. It is not able to filter high-grade military-grade nerve gas or anything of that nature. Sometimes our journalists overseas, they vet that question back to me from time to time, but it is for law enforcement use only. We provide equipment for, we're talking here about kind of a worst-case scenario, but as you guys know, journalists are high risk covering natural disasters, hurricanes and fires, the forest fires out west. We coordinate with the subject matter experts on that. I don't have the ability nor the expertise to be able to provide that kind of equipment, so we take the lead in coordinating with the subject matter experts when it comes to journalists, covering natural disasters, if you will. So we're really comfortable with our program. The challenge for me and our journalists is to be able to have that training on a repetitive basis. Active shooter training we're in the process of doing that. We've had Special Agent G. Kim, who is now retired, that was his entire job for 20 years with the FBI as far as active shooter training. So we're now doing it internally, and we're in the process of actually doing it in all our bureaus right now. We also, one of my responsibilities is also setting up perimeter security at our bureaus. That is a challenge for me because not all we lease a lot of space out there, and not all, building managers are really buying into it, despite all the mass shootings that we've had, disgruntled employees, so on and so forth going in. You still have building managers out there who basically feel as though they don't want to employ magnetometers and x-rays at their facility for fear of the aesthetics of it. But one of my favorite lines to each and every one of them is, as soon as something dramatic happens here, the costs associated with that and the things that you're concerned about will take place the next day. There's no doubt in my mind. So we're trying to be, again, proactive and, being more preventive as opposed to being reactive. Reactive, as a previous speaker said, is easy. I mean, I can tell you how crime took place after it's taken place. I can tell you what things we should have done after it's taken place. So we we really put a lot of emphasis, and the fact of the matter is that the AP has a separate division that is a focus on that, allows me to be able to do some things a little bit creative. We can't do anything without our partners, our law enforcement partners, our partners in the private sector, and actually reach out to academia when it comes to looking at suspicious behavior and activity. So it's a wide-range program. We have the benefit of having that. Unfortunately, there's been 35 journalists killed throughout the history of the AP. 4 have occurred on my watch, which I'm not. It bothers me, the fact that it did happen. One was an intern in Mexico City working for the AP who was found deceased. I went down and investigated that and with the local authorities there, and it was an unfortunate situation, which is an unresolved case right now. It will be an open, they've agreed to make it a cold case. There were a lot of people there who didn't say anything about it. We lost a journalist on the West Bank who was photographing a unexploded ordnance, and he exploded. The Israelis were with them. There were a couple of Israelis that were security people that were injured. We had a second journalist that was with him that was seriously injured but not killed, but we did lose one. They did have on their protective gear, but obviously due to the close proximity to the unexplosive device that they were filming, he succumbed to his injuries. The most disturbing one for me is because my law enforcement background is the death of Anna Nijinghas, who was in 2014, who was covering the Afghan elections. She was paired with Kathy Gannon out of our Pakistan office, and they were covering the elections, and they were attacked by a police officer. The military was designed to protect this caravan of journalists who were covering the elections. They had stopped at a town to decide what their next strategy was going to be as far as moving on. Anna and Kathy took respite in the back seat of one of the cars, and a local police officer comes up and he grabs the AK-47 from the military guy there, and he opens up on Anna and Kathy. Kathy was seriously injured. To date, she is still undergoing surgeries for her wounds, and Anna was she was deceased. She was killed instantly as a result of that attack. There were some teaching points there, and again, you have 2 journalists there who made the ultimate sacrifice in news gathering, in that they sacrificed their lives. But there's always things to be learned by that, and one of the things that bothers me more than anything is that neither were wearing their protective gear. They had protective gear. That's not to say that Anna would have been able to survive her wounds as a result of the body armor that was issued to both of them, but they weren't wearing it. And you guys know this because I get it from journalists all the time. You have the equipment, but you wear it on a case by when you feel comfortable or the conditions are right because of the heat and uncomfortableness of it. You're talking to a person who's worn body armor for 28 years with Secret Service with a suit on, okay? So when it comes to your life, we encourage our folks, wear it. We have it, wear it. We've made it easier for some journalists to be able to have a protective gear that is more suitable to covering protests and demonstrations, and those that are maybe working with the military as embeds and in war zones. So we have 2 types of body armor, and to make things easier on folks. So we are comfortable with our plan. We're always looking for more and experimental ways to improve that.
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring in Commander Guillermo Rivera, and what I want you to talk a little bit about is this issue of protests. because I think that really is for U.S.-based reporters, that is one of the most potentially threatening situations, and it's a common thing, that we have to cover that happens, especially in this city. And so, as Margaux pointed out, so what I'd like to hear from you is a little bit about sort of the law enforcement perspective. What I'm talking about is, and I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul at the 2008 Republican convention, where things got out of hand in the sense of not only, protesters getting violent, but a police overreaction and a sweeping up of journalists in dragnets. And so how did journalists avoid finding themselves in the wrong position? What do they need to understand, perhaps, about how law enforcement approaches these kind of scenarios?
Sure. So this is a very tricky situation, of course, for us. Here in the city, in 2018, we handled probably about close to 1,000 protests in the city. We handled more demonstrations than anywhere else in the country here in D.C. And some of those are 3 people demonstrating on a corner. And then, of course, we have the very large ones. And when you consider the number of protests that we handle, by and large, they all go very peacefully, and MPD has I think, a very good strategy in the way we deal with them. Just so you understand, there is a thin line between when a demonstration turns into a full-blown riot, like during the inauguration, for example, where we had in front of I believe the Washington Post building right outside there, where the car was on fire and all that stuff. So first of all, you got to look for cues, number one, of what's going on in the crowds. You got to know that if you see individuals gathering up and maybe they're picking up stashed weapons or that type of thing, you want to keep yourself safe there, and you do want to separate yourself from that. At the end of the day, it comes down to self-preservation. When law enforcement comes in and if they're dealing with a very large mass of individuals, it's in a chaotic scene like that, it's difficult to make out who's press and who isn't, who's involved in that demonstration and who isn't. And I personally have been in some demonstration, not involved in the demonstration, but where I've been on the police monitoring a demonstration where there may be some folks that, amateur journalists, for example, who are in and out of the role of they're journalists or they're involved with the group or very well intertwined with the group. So consider that from a law enforcement perspective when you're dealing with that. It's very easy after all the dust settles to say, I wasn't involved in that, I'm just here to report it. So ideally you'd have some form of whatever your identifier may be. If you have the opportunity when something like that has taken place, maybe you let law enforcement know before anything gets chaotic. I just want you to know I'm here doing X, Y, and Z. When we had the Venezuelan demonstrations going on up on 30th Street in Georgetown, it was peaceful pretty much, even though it lasted a very long time. It was peaceful, and we were very aware of who the journalists were, they're amateur or not. So from law enforcement's perspective, that being able to identify who it is that you're dealing with really makes things much easier. And really, and like I said, the ones that I'm talking about really that where it makes a huge difference is when it becomes chaotic and when the law is being broken. As the way we deal with demonstrations here in the city, our arrest is a last case scenario for us. So we will, unless there's being property destroyed or someone is being injured or there's counter protesters and there's fighting going on, we don't put our hands on anybody. We will come in and we'll develop lines or whatever, maybe keep separation, that type of stuff to, as long as it's staying peaceful, we'll let it go on. And so that lets you know that the threshold has to be pretty high for us to put our hands and arrest anybody or use any kind of chemical weapons, things like OC spray or pepper spray, that type of stuff. So, but once, so if you see signs that something is getting dangerous, I would advise you to pull yourself out of the situation to the extent that you can. Of course, you want to be well identified and try to communicate with the law enforcement authorities on scene so that they understand, hey, listen, I'm not here to be involved in that and be in conflict with the authorities. I'm just here to report, and that will put officers at ease. So
if I can piggyback that, Commander, I was in Minneapolis as well, and we had met previously with, I personally had met with the command level, the chief of police and his command level people there to explain to them that we had just dealt with a situation in the UK, where the UK, basically, their law enforcement, they have a methodology called kettling, where they just grab everybody, and then they decide what to do later. And so I was concerned that that might happen in Minneapolis, and the chief, as well as the commander, says that we might, because of the identification issue that you alluded to, we would get everybody and they put them on his buses, and then at that point they would discern who would be pressed and who would be processed. That didn't happen because I was there on the scene, and the sergeant basically said his lieutenant told him that they were going to arrest everybody and process everybody. And he didn't care what the commander or the chief had arranged with the media, and particularly me personally. So it became a little bit of a contentious setup, if you will. We had already prepared our legal people with the idea that there might be journalists that are going to be arrested, so we already had local counsel there to to expedite their release and whatnot. But I bring that up only to say that sometimes the message doesn't get to the guys in the field on the ground. Even though we had a nice plan, it didn't quite work out the way we wanted to, because there were quite a few journalists that were arrested.
Okay.
Well, and just to respond
yes,
to that
of course,
really quickly, that may happen in other parts of the country, but the whole kettling thing, for us to get to that point with us, there's a riot going on at that point. We don't kettle a regular demonstration group. And so it doesn't mean that every officer is perfect, because we're human beings at the end of the day, and we're all we can all make mistakes, but certainly that isn't this whole thing of disregarding authority. There will be consequences for that type of thing, and we have a very strict policy. And our policy for First Amendment demonstrations is all available on our website, so you can actually view that for those who are based in D.C.
Right, thank you very much.
Can I
Yes,
just
quickly.
add a quick point? Do you think that, or question to you, do you think that there's receptivity to the idea of having trainings for police officers who do cover, who are working on protest beat, to kind of have more awareness about what the journalists that are covering that kind of event might look like and how their behavior might be, because they might move in a certain way to get angles if they're photographing or videotaping that kind of demonstration. And it kind of seems like if there was mutual understanding from journalists about how you guys do your job, and how from the police officers from how journalists do their job, that might be a good positive way to kind of bridge that gap in places around the country.
I would think yes. As it relates to D.C., our public information office, I think, would certainly think that would be beneficial for ours to see because it's not the clear ones that had the press passes or that type of thing. It's the folks that may pop up a phone or something and start videotaping, and they're really doing it to do a story on Facebook or whatever it may be. So sure, that could help. I think anything like that could help, but I still stand by, if you can identify yourself to the authorities on scene, that's going to make it much easier, because in the chaotic scene, and before it gets to chaos, you got to understand that officers are there to preserve, to maintain the peace first. So that's going to be their ultimate goal.
Thank you. I was going to ask you a question, Nadine, but I feel like at this point we really should turn it over to the audience, and you'll probably have an opportunity to answer one or two of them. Please identify yourself, no statements, questions, and be brief.
I'm Bob Rosenblatt, a freelance writer. In the first presentation, some of the slides with the fight back showed a stone and then a pair of scissors. Does it make sense to carry that with you, or will that get you in trouble with security? I guess what I'm asking, is there anything such as a defensive weapon for reporters?
Whoever.
So we use a couple of things that we demo in trainings, and some of them are related to things that you could carry with you, and some of them are related to your physical security when you're traveling. But a couple of simple tools that I don't think have been mentioned yet today. When we have teams out in the field, they always have door alarms with them. These are those small little wedges, and as soon as it's like a little plate on top of it, you can get it for $7 on Amazon. You wedge it under any standard hotel door, and if somebody tries to break in, it sets off a really loud alarm. You can also get body alarms that you can like press if somebody's attacking you, just to attract attention to yourself. Something that might be a little bit more controversial among our friends on the panel. There are also these tactical pens that you could carry. It's actually a pen, but it's very sharp on one side. It effectively works like a knife. Yeah, but true. Somebody could get that from you and then use it against you. So it's really also based on your skill level, and also pepper spray. Another one that's, you might get sprayed yourself, but it does give you another tool.
Just to kind of jump on that too, and I think that's about who is the attacker, right? Because if you're getting attacked by, maybe if you are in a place where the police in that country are actually a hostile force and are targeting journalists and want to silence them, places like Burundi in Africa, for example, where journalists have been forced disappeared, that might be really what you need to have just to protect yourself. However, I think some police forces here, even here in the United States, if you have certain materials with you, it could make you a target or make people suspicious of you, that you're not actually just peacefully there to report. And that's happened in some other foreign countries. I think a couple of years ago, journalists had a body armor and was going into a place like Thailand and was arrested by the police because that was not authorized material for him to exercise his profession, and they thought that that was very suspicious. So I think that that's also kind of something to keep in mind, and it really depends on who the attacker is and what the climate is. But I think that those tools are really easy basics to have, especially if you're more vulnerable and you're a female journalist.
We don't issue any type of weapons for our journalists. We do issue the personal body alarm. It's called a Defender. There's two types. One is a little smaller than the other. It's made out of the UK. Due to the sexual assaults that were taking place in India, or still take place in India, our female journalists requested it, so we issued them at that time. We also used them during the Olympics and the World Cup, where we had journalists staying in not so good areas, so we issued those as well. So, but we don't advocate the issuance of weapons.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you have to be aware of what the laws are in the jurisdiction where you're practicing. You guys do have a very dangerous job, probably more dangerous than ours in some respects, because you're not going in with the same type of training and weapons that we have. I will say something that was mentioned, a pen with a sharp edge on it. That's in DC. That's a prohibited weapon because you're using it. You would be using it as a actual weapon. There are, just personal protection devices some people have. Like if you have car keys on you, that can be used as a weapon, and that's something that would be readily available to you. I will say that clearly in a situation where you're fighting for your life, who cares what's legal? And that's one thing to remember. It doesn't matter what's legal. Everything goes out the window. You're fighting to survive at that point. But if you're just talking about someone harassing you on the street or something like that, the best thing to do in a case like that is just get out of Dodge. If you have to fight, then pick up whatever it is that you can and go with it. That's that's pretty obvious, I think.
Yeah.
My name is Dagmar Thiel with Fundamedios. Sorry, John, I've got a lot of questions in there. I will try to keep it short. I'm impressed about AP to have a senior executive in charge of security. I don't know if that it's the state of the art in the media in North America. If not, congratulations for that. And the question is it normal to speak to persons in charge of security for rallies, don't to arrest journalists before that rally? What you made is this normal for U.S.?
To try and convince
people not to arrest the journalists, or is this just a new situation that you are figuring out as a threat, and you go as a precaution to all the rallies and say, hey, don't arrest our journalists or journalists at all?
No, that's correct. That's part of the protocols that we follow and for special events. That's the Olympics, World Cup, all our major sporting events. It could be the Super Bowl. We sit down and we coordinate with the local law enforcement what the arrangements are for the media that are covering that event. And so presidential elections are the same thing. Now, we haven't done the rallies, okay? But the conventions we will do, and any major special event.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I can't imagine that any department in the country would be trained to, hey, if just group them up and arrest them. For us, we need probable cause for every person that we're arresting, even in a situation like that. And we're a little stricter here in D.C. But that sounds like a rogue situation. What you explained earlier, that shouldn't be part of the training. And yeah, we tell our people, make sure that you're able to make that distinction, or attempt to make that distinction before you do any kind of arrest.
And getting back to the point that was made about knowing the jurisdiction, the acceptability of personal protective equipment. In Cleveland, during the presidential convention, they would not allow our journalists to have gas masks because it was really kind of interesting. Within the city of Cleveland, it was illegal to have gas masks. However, outside the city limits, it was fine. So this is one of the things you explore when you're
like
doing
fireworks.
these special events. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. I know there are more questions, so again, we'll have just a minute between between these sessions, and these guys will be available to ask questions, and then we will start with our third and final panel in just a few moments.